During early 1942, it was rather rapidly becoming clear that Japan was reaching the limits of its expansion across the Pacific. Both their own pre-war doctrine and Allied actions told them that pretty soon various outlying garrisons would become isolated as a counter-offensive got underway. The Guadalcanal campaign served only to underline this, as well as the general issues with transporting supplies via surface ship, even at night. Although out of necessity frontline submarines were diverted to be used as ad hoc transports at the Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese Navy High Command wasn't especially happy with either the temporary loss of the submarine services to the front lines, or the more permanent loss of their services that often resulted when those subs ran into Allied surface forces who were looking to interdict the supply runs. And so, in mid-1942, design work started on a dedicated transport submarine class, work which would be expanded to cover a number of other classes of various sizes, capabilities, and allegiances. The largest class would be the Type D submarines. Unfortunately, this designation is sometimes also used for Japanese midget submarines, which can lead to a bit of confusion, but in any case, these vessels were quite large and took their designation as a continuation from the A, B, and C categories of other large Japanese Navy subs. This was further subdivided into the D1 and D2 types. The D1 displaced just under 1,800 tons on the surface and just over 2,200 tons submerged, capable of 13 knots when surfaced and 6.5 knots underwater thanks to a pair of diesels that outputted 850 brake horsepower on the surface and 1,200 horsepower worth of electrical motor output when underwater. Initially, after some internal arguments, armament consisted of a pair of torpedo tubes in the bow, a 5.5-inch deck gun, and a pair of single 25mm anti-aircraft guns, the latter of which could be retracted to allow for specially sealed landing craft and externally mounted cargo units to be placed atop the casing. However, after the first submarine, I-361, conducted its sea trials, the torpedoes were removed in favour of more cargo space, and no further D-type submarine would be built with torpedo tubes included. Cargo was carried in three areas: a large forward compartment where the torpedo room otherwise would be on a regular sub, another compartment just aft of the control room, which also had a conveyor installed to help move cargo in and out, and finally two specially pressure-sealed landing craft which could then be placed atop the sub. Total cargo capacity was 22 tons internally, mostly in the aft compartment, and 110 troops, scattered all over the sub, but mostly in the forward compartment, in addition to the 75-strong crew. Another 60 tons of cargo could be carried externally, either placed in the landing craft or in pressure-sealed cases if these were available. Work started on the subs in 1943, and all commissioned in 1944, but out of 104 originally planned, only a dozen were completed, 7 of which were sunk at sea by US forces, another was sunk in harbour by airstrikes, and 4 survived to be surrendered. 8 of them were converted in 1945, while the war was still ongoing, to each carry 5 Kai-10 suicide torpedoes. For that, they had to have their guns removed. These would be followed by the D2 type, a slightly modified variant with 100 less horsepower on the diesels and a fractionally shorter but deeper hull form, and 15 less men in the crew. Its range was cut by 2/3 compared to the D1, from 15,000 nautical miles on the surface to just 5,000, mainly due to a significant portion of the submarine's fuel tanks being replaced with sealed tanks, which would then be used to transport various refined fuels as cargo, such as aviation fuel. To access these tanks, the sub could only carry a single sealed landing craft. 6 were ordered, but 4 of these were cancelled. 1 was still incomplete at the end of the war, and that meant that only the class lead I-373 would enter service in April 1945, and she was sunk exactly 4 months after commissioning by USS Spikefish. A related development was the SH type, or I-351 class. These were much larger, at about 3,500 tons on the surface and almost 4,300 tons submerged, with 3,700 horsepower diesels and 1,200 horsepower motors for 16 knots surfaced, or almost, and 6.3 knots submerged. They were originally intended as replacements for seaplane tenders during the latter stages of the war, again due to the vulnerability of surface ships. They carried 4 torpedoes in the bow, although no reloads were to be carried, as these were supposed to be last-ditch defense weapons only. They also had a number of 3-inch mortars installed, as the Japanese Navy was running out of 5-inch deck guns, and 7 25mm anti-aircraft guns were also carried in a mixture of twin and single mounts. With a total crew of 90, 13 of which were air crew, they were supposed to transport 365 tons of aviation fuel, 11 tons of fresh water, and either 60 550-pound bombs or 30 bombs and 15 airdrop torpedoes, as well as general supplies. This would allow them to act as one-stop replenishment points for large seaplanes operating out of small atolls and lagoons. Like the D-2s, 6 were ordered, but only 2 were actually laid down, and only the class lead I-351 entered service, having been converted in the interim into a submarine tanker. She was sunk in July 1945 after just over 6 months in active service by USS Bluefish. With the range from Japan to various holdout bases rapidly shrinking and slow progress and high losses among the big cargo subs, a last type, the SS type or HA-101 class, was designed for mass production. An all-welded modular sub, it displaced only 430 tons on the surface and just under 500 tons submerged, with 400 horsepower diesels and a single 150 horsepower electric motor, giving it a speed of 10 knots on the surface and 5 when submerged. A crew of 21 men had just a single 25mm anti-aircraft gun for defense, with a total cargo capacity of 60 tons possible. Some of these submarines would be altered to act as mini motherships for the less suicidal versions of the Japanese mini-subs, being fitted with a hoist and 10 small 18-inch torpedoes secreted between the pressure hull and the outer casing for reloads. 100 of these craft were ordered, but only 12 were actually laid down, of which 10 entered service, and surprisingly, all of them actually survived the war. In typical fashion, the Imperial Japanese Army also started their own parallel cargo and transport submarine development line, coming up with 3 different classes of small sub, 2 of which were actually produced before the war ended. But that's a story for another time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.